Yes, but
I don't know. Okay, welcome everyone to the 2007 Harold K. Schilling Memorial Lecture on Science, Technology and Society. Now, the focus of these lecture series has in the past been and is to be the connections and interactions between ethics, science, technology and the human condition. Now, for those of you who don't know, Harold K. Schilling was a physicist, professor and Dean of the Graduate School here at Penn State. He was also president of the American Association of Physics Teachers, which gave him their Distinguished Service Citation in 1960. His work as a physicist included work in the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II, where he worked on supersonic signaling. But later on in life, he became very interested in the interactions between science and religion, and in 1962 wrote a book entitled Science and Religion, an interpretation of two communities. Followed some years later by an interestingly entitled article in 1969, which was entitled Towards a Confluence of Scientific and Christian Faiths. A title which I think would have been provocative to many scientists at the time. This lecture is, of course, sponsored by the Schilling Endowment, by the Graduate School, the Rock Ethics Institute, and is indeed also the second of 3 bioethics lectures to be held in this auditorium in this academic year. The third, and I encourage you all to attend, is a lecture by Susan Lindy on April the 23rd about medical triage in wartime. Now, a very brave man once wrote that Christians too often evaluate the findings in the natural sciences solely in terms of their own prior faith commitments, and appropriating only those scientific findings that do not directly challenge these prior commitments. However, if a genuine dialogue is to take place between participants in these fields, Christians must be willing to consider how the findings of the natural sciences might lead them to reevaluate their commitments, perhaps even to the point of reconceptualizing or relinquishing some of their most fundamental and cherished beliefs. Now, that's a statement by a very brave and wise man, a man who is a priest. Now, there would have been a time when men would have been burned at the stake for saying such things. I have good news for you on 2 fronts. First of all, the author of that statement was not burned at the stake. And second enough, we are fortunate enough to have him as the Schilling Lecturer this year. Particularly valuable, I think, given the interests of Professor Schilling himself in the interaction between science and religion. Dr. Heller, our Schilling Lecturer for 2007, is the Systems Director of the Office of Ethics and Theology for Providence Health and Services, which is a non-profit based in Seattle, but extending across 5 states with approximately 50,000 employees, which makes it rival Penn State, I guess. He plans and oversees the development of the ethics programs that further the understanding of the ethical and theological foundations of healthcare, and with a particular focus on corporate and social policies and decisions within the system. Dr. Heller holds an A.B. in Chemistry cum laude from King's College, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he received his Ph.D. in Ethics and Society from Emory University. His dissertation, Human Genome Research and the Challenge of Contingent Future Persons, was published in 1996. He's also the co-author of Faithful Living, Faithful Dying, Anglican Reflections on End-of-Life Care, and the co-author of 2 other books. In addition, he's the author of 35 book chapters and articles, including the one I read the passage from just a few moments ago. Dr. Heller is a frequent speaker and regular consultant to hospitals and other healthcare organizations on issues in biomedical ethics. He is, as I said, a priest in the Episcopal Church and recently served on the Church's task force on ethics and the new genetics. He lives on Bainbridge Island in Puget Sound, a place I've never visited but hope to one day. He's here with his wife, Linda. They have a daughter, Abigail, and Dr. Heller assures me that when he has time, which given his great publication record and his full-time job, I imagine is very little, he enjoys sailing and getting away. So please join me in welcoming the 2007 Schilling Lecturer, Dr. Heller.
Jonathan, you'd just be kind enough to give me my water back. And I'm very, very pleased to be here. I don't know when I've been received more warmly in an academic setting than I have been here, and I appreciate the hospitality very much. The downside of all that hospitality is I'm beginning to lose my voice, and I'm running out of steam a little bit, but hopefully I'll get through the lecture and the rest of the day. Thank you for those kind words. And I'd also like to thank the Dean Pell and the selection committee for their invitation, and so many of you have been very helpful in this trip and getting everything organized. Today, after that provocative introduction by Professor Marks, I'm not going to really talk too much about theology. I do have some references to some theological issues which we can discuss after the lecture if you're interested, because they do play into our story on understanding disasters. Here's what I hope to cover today, and I understand we have about an hour and a half, and I won't talk hopefully nearly that long, so we'll have time for some discussion. I want to briefly talk about my own interests and the origin of my own interest in disasters, because this is a relatively new interest for me in the last few years. I remarked to somebody that it's kind of like starting a dissertation all over again. It's a real new field, but it's very interesting. Turns out it's very complex, and I was meeting this morning with a group here on the campus that is trying to plan for possibility of pandemic disaster. And we all kind of agreed together that it's a very complex subject. And I'll have a brief word about the title, and then I want to really get into the meat of what I want to try to do today, and what animates me in my own research, at least at this stage of my research, and that is trying to bring ethics to bear on disasters. When I started this research, it wasn't obvious to me how ethics could be brought to bear or should be brought to bear on the question of disasters. And so I've spent a good deal of time trying to wrestle with that. In fact, most of the presentation is on that. Locating and tracing the moral agency in disasters. If ethics is going to be brought to bear, we have to be able to find some agent that can be held responsible and or accountable, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And hopefully then we'll have some time to review some implications and some questions. Until recently, most work in bioethics, and there hasn't been much, frankly, on disasters, came from the public health side. The few bioethicists that have written on disasters have been criticized in press by some of our colleagues as basically claiming that if only we had universal health care in the United States, all the problems of disasters would be met. Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but in my reading of the few articles that are out there on bioethics, or on disasters by bioethicists, I think it's not a completely unfair charge. Bioethicists like myself that are working in the acute and non-acute healthcare settings began to attend, I think, to disasters in earnest, like so many of us in this room probably did with 9/11. When we watched the medical personnel respond to the attacks, and then afterwards as the city confronted its health implications from the debris field. Some implications, I gather, that are still being felt. And then again in 2003 when we observed our medical colleagues in Toronto struggling with the SARS outbreak, the severe acute respiratory syndrome. My own research was kind of stimulated after watching these earlier events. My own research was really stimulated by what I call this nearly apocalyptic year that began in late 2004 and continued through October of 2005 with a tsunami in December of 2004, then hurricanes Katrina and Rita in August and September of 2005, and then finally, you probably remember the earthquake, that awful earthquake in Pakistan. And then at the same time, my own health system was beginning to develop a pandemic preparedness plan, and I was asked to review that. All of this is basically background to say that I was completely unprepared to do this, and had to. I actually used the excuse of the Skilling lecture to delve deeply into some of the literature. These reflections in the end, though, are still preliminary for me, and in at least two senses. They're preliminary to thinking about ethics in disaster, and here I'm building on a distinction that I found helpful by a guy named King, who discusses the potential to misallocate public health funds in the name of disaster preparation. It's an ongoing issue of concern. But he distinguished between ethics of disaster and ethics in disaster. And the discussion that you're going to have on the next lecture on triage, for example, would be an example of ethics in disaster. How do we make selection amongst people who are injured or sick when there's limited time and resources available? Ethics of disaster is kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture from a little different perspective. And that's what I was really interested in doing, again, trying to figure out how can ethics be brought to bear, especially on something called a natural disaster. There are other kinds of disaster, but especially that question, how can ethics be brought to bear on that question? It wasn't obvious to me. The second way this is preliminary for me is that I have ended this phase in my research with more questions than answers. And I hope I don't disappoint you. I think for myself it's been a profitable exercise, and I've come away with a much clearer sense of where I need to go with my further research, especially as I start to turn to the even more complex question of ethics in disaster. So we begin with what is often called the Great Lisbon Earthquake, which began at 9:30 a.m. on the 1st of November in 1755 on All Saints' Day. The priests and religious folks that interpreted the significance of this disaster in religious terms made a lot out of the fact that it happened on All Saints' Day. It was centered about 125 miles west-southwest of Cape St. Vincent. It hit in 3 massive jolts lasting about 10 minutes and is now thought to have been close to a magnitude of 9.0 on the Richter scale. People immediately fled the city to the river, boarding ships and boats anchored there to escape. But 30 minutes after the quake, a tsunami hit. In 3 waves, it hit outside of Lisbon about 30 feet in height, and elsewhere on the coast it was up to 100 feet. Fires quickly began in the fallen debris. They had opened fires, of course, for their kitchens, and might have been contained, except that masses of people fled into the streets and threw their belongings into the streets as well, trying to save their belongings, and it clogged the streets, cutting off access to the fire brigades. The fires burned for 5 days. And it was estimated that, I've read different estimates for this, anywhere from 30 to 60,000 people died that day, or those days, out of a population of approximately 275. In the end, one of Europe's largest and most beautiful cities was almost completely destroyed. And what's significant about this is hard for us to comprehend from our vantage point. But I'm quoting here, the Lisbon earthquake shocked, quote, Western civilization more than any event since the fall of Rome. It's significant for us in that it was the first earthquake to be studied scientifically, but more importantly, it signaled a fundamental change in how we think about disasters generally. It marked a transition in the West from thinking about disasters as acts of God to viewing them as, and I say here, merely natural events. And what's significant about this difference is that with acts of God, natural and moral evils are causally linked. Okay? Think about that. Natural and moral evils are causally linked. Presumably as justly deserved punishment for sin. So I do something wrong, Something bad happens to me, and it's interpreted by myself or people around me as being justly deserved punishment for something I did wrong, as punishment for sin. God was thought to be responsible, a cause of disasters, but not accountable, not morally blamed for disasters. The victims were blamed, something that we still do, actually, a lot of. And I'm going to come back to this distinction between responsible and accountable in a few minutes. But essentially, responsible refers to those acts that are caused by an agent, and accountable is referring to those acts for which we can be held morally blameworthy, or we can be morally praised for them. Reflecting on the Lisbon earthquake led Enlightenment philosophers to decouple, to break apart natural evil from moral evil. And as Job protested his innocence to God, so these philosophers argued that the inhabitants of Lisbon did not, and could not deserve such punishment. God would not be just to send such punishment on the people. However, after this decoupling, and I'm putting on a couple of slides here what was a long and complex process. After this decoupling, bad things just happen to good people. The how could be explained eventually by scientific research, but no reason or explanation, there's no why that could be given for disasters, and no moral agent could be identified. So when there are acts of God, you could identify a moral agent, the human beings who had done something wrong, and God who was ultimately responsible for the evil that was brought to bear on them. Essentially, those people who were killed were seen as somehow getting a just desert for their sin, and those people who observed this or were somehow otherwise adversely affected were seen as being given a warning not to do this again. But when natural disasters happened, it was just luck. It was just an unfortunate event. Okay? So that preserved, interestingly enough, and this is the theological part we can talk about later if you want to, it allowed philosophers and theologians to preserve this notion that God was somehow just, but also it rendered God irrelevant to understanding these events as a side effect. And so if we can't identify a moral agent, and here you begin to see my concern and my problem, how can we bring ethics to bear on disasters? Again, especially we're starting here with natural disasters. So first, to answer this question, I have to give you a brief glance at how I understand ethics in a slide or two. And that's always dangerous, but I'm going to try here. Ethics is about a lot of things, but it's about at least analyzing and evaluating the choices that we have to make as human beings. And the reason that the choices are important, of course, is that they allow us to affect the future, and people in the future, for better or for worse. Choices are points of contingency. Philosophers talk about creating different worlds. If I go down one route, there's a different world created. If I go down another way, another world is created. And sometimes those choices are indifferent. What I had for lunch today probably is not going to make the world, one world or the other, all that better or worse. But how we make decisions that might affect or come to bear on disasters could make very different kind of future worlds for us. And we make these choices in three rough domains. And this is just for analysis here. What we do, our conduct, our character, who we want to be or become. And then this last one's a little bit more abstract, what I call conditions. These are things that influence but do not determine what we do or who we become. And here I'm thinking about the policies that we follow habitually. We stop at or our laws, for example. We stop at stop signs, most of us. We stop at stoplights, that kind of thing. We don't think about those, but those are conditions that are set up that help us to do the right thing, or when we break those conditions, to do the wrong thing. But one of the things that we can develop later if we want to in conversation is to note that as we go down this list, we have less and less control over the outcomes of these choices, and they become harder and harder to actually affect. So we have most control over our conduct, presumably. We have some control over our character, especially when we're younger, or more likely, other people have control over our character or choices that they can make for it. But when it comes to influencing decisions, especially on a massive level of society, it gets pretty tough to do that. Though, if we can't influence them, if we can't make choices about them, then we cannot bring ethics to bear on them. So anything that we can't influence, that we can't make choices about, we can't bring ethics to bear on. So this requires that disasters also be analyzed in terms of human choice, at least in this narrow sense that I'm thinking of ethics. And more controversially, it requires that humans have at least some limited control over the outcomes of their choices. Now that's a more debated point by ethicists, but I think that if we don't have control over at least some modest control over our outcomes, it's hard to hold us responsible or accountable. And otherwise, if we can't bring ethics to bear, if there is no moral agent involved, disasters could have tragic consequences for humans, obviously, but they remain outside of our moral consideration. But if disasters can be analyzed in moral terms, we should be able to assign some kind of moral responsibility and moral accountability. Now, I mentioned this already, so I won't belabor this, but very briefly, an agent who is identified as a cause of an action can be said to be responsible for it. An agent who can be morally praised or blamed for an action can be said to be accountable for it. And agents can be responsible but not accountable, like a driver who was unable to avoid hitting a car that suddenly pulled out in front of him. So I caused the accident by driving into that car, but it's not my fault. I shouldn't be blamed for it. As my daughter would say, it's not my fault. Accountable but not responsible. So I'm a military officer and I have some people below me that do something that's either something to be praised or blamed for, and I'm held accountable for it, but I didn't actually cause the actions that they did. Or I can be both responsible and accountable as a driver who negligently causes an accident. Okay? So keep those distinctions in mind when you think about disasters and agents that cause disasters and agents that might be accountable for disasters, if in fact we can find such a thing. So back to Lisbon now after that little break on ethics. After Lisbon, because of this decoupling of natural and moral evils, we could, at least initially, find no reason or explanation that could explain disasters in any kind of satisfactory way, unless, and this is where they eventually landed, it could be found in human failure. So interestingly enough, the decoupling of natural and moral evil actually led to a greater emphasis on human agency, suggesting that we can and should avoid or work our way out of the evils that befall us. It's one of the interesting historical developments from that Lisbon earthquake. So from that point forward, human understanding and control of the conditions contributing to disasters become increasingly important, and God becomes increasingly irrelevant, at least to understanding disasters, in many other ways as well, that we won't go into today. So our focus today is primarily on analysis rather than evaluation, in terms of going back to ethics being about analysis and evaluation. I'm not trying to figure out whether a particular agent is right or wrong, good or bad, but I'm trying to understand how agency might be involved in disasters. And then secondly, our focus today is mostly in terms of not so much on conduct and not so much on character, even though those are relevant, but mostly on the conditions of our lives that lead us into disasters or affect our experience of disasters. Conditions are perhaps, as I mentioned, the hardest domain for individual or collective moral agents to exercise control. And as we'll see, it is sometimes hard to identify who can, has, or even should make a choice about such conditions that might lead to disasters or to prevent them. So now I want to jump from 1755 and that introductory material to thinking about how to bring ethics to bear in disasters. And here, what I've done is I've focused on a number of, I call them approaches. They're really different theoretical models that are used in the social sciences for understanding disasters. And I want to note, as we go through these, and I hope it's not too tedious for us, but as we go through them, I want to note how human responsibility and accountability, number one, are located in these different approaches. And number two, then, how human accountability, as we go through them, actually increases and then sometimes shifts between different agents. So hopefully that will be clear as we go. This came up in discussion this morning about command and control approaches to preparing for disasters. Early U.S. disaster research had reveals or had a Cold War bias. Disaster research was used by military and U.S. researchers to try to predict the effects of an unexpected attack on U.S. populations. And the idea was that maybe there's an analogy that can be made between people's response to disasters and people's response to, say, a nuclear attack or some other kind of unexpected attack. And again, they tended to emphasize, like military models do, a centralized command and control in the planning and response. And the overall aim of this early approach was to return communities to normalcy, i.e. normal functioning, as soon as possible. The most widely cited early social science definition shares this understanding, definition of disaster. Here I'm quoting from Fritz, 1961, an event concentrated in time and space in which a society or a relatively self-sufficient subdivision of a society undergoes severe danger and incurs such losses to its members and physical appurtenances that the social structure is disrupted and the fulfillment of all or some of its essential functions of society is prevented. So think about that kind of an understanding of disaster as an analog for an attack, an unexpected or unwarranted attack on a U.S. city. It assumes that communities are organized around a necessary set of functions. For those of you in sociology, that's a functionalist kind of bias here, that are occasionally disrupted by natural and it can be extended to technological agents or events. So we understand essentially disasters as external agents or external events happening to us, and oftentimes unexpected. When routine emergency responses to disasters are overwhelmed, coping measures must be improvised. And that's one of the ways that you distinguish an emergency situation from a disaster in this literature. Emergency situation is something that can be handled by our kind of normal, everyday emergency planning procedures and institutions. When those get overwhelmed, you're starting to look at what might be called a disaster, at least in this model. And preparedness was believed to improve both the routine and the improvised responses. And these are in turn thought to be affected by particular characteristics of the disaster or agent itself. And I'm not going to go through these too much, but just to note very quickly that these are the kinds of things that would affect our understanding of disasters in this model. The speed of onset, the length of the warning period, magnitude of the physical event, the geographical scope and temporal duration of the event, and the familiarity of the affected communities with the event. So we're used to looking at tornadoes, but we're not used to looking at hurricanes or earthquakes. Might make a difference. And increasingly, governments, remember I talked about human responsibility now. Here, governments are increasingly viewed as accountable, morally and legally accountable for mitigation and preparation for these kind of events. So governments, in kind of a vague way, become the primary moral agents in this event. Now, the second approach, and it's probably the dominant approach today, is the hazard approach. In the agent and event approach, disasters are things that happen to rather passive and surprised humans. Agency is limited to preparation and efforts to reduce the duration and negative consequences. So go back here, you have this natural event, oftentimes, mostly a natural event, that happens to us. We can't blame the nature, not rationally anyway, but we can hold government accountable for not having prepared us adequately for this. But the hazard approach takes a little slightly different approach. The hazard approach views societal vulnerability to disaster as a joint product of the event itself and the choices regarding human use, what's called the human use system. So in other words, hurricanes don't cause disasters. Hurricanes coming ashore in populated areas cause disasters. So disasters are not natural events. They're natural events that coincide with unfortunate kinds of situations for humans. Here's a quote. Many disaster losses, rather than stemming from unexpected events, are the predictable result of interaction among three major systems. The physical environment, which includes the hazard event, social and demographic characteristics of the communities that experience them, and the buildings, roads, bridges, and other components of the constructed environment. In other words, societies under this model create vulnerabilities for themselves in their search for resources. And here's some examples: the use of floodplains for crops, seaside or other unstable locations for commercial enterprises, or simply for scenic views if you live on the Carolina coast, for example, or the West Coast. Disasters occur when societies adopt patterns of land use, construction, and economic activities that are vulnerable to these extreme events. So we're moving from something that just happens to us to something that happens to us but also is influenced. That which happens to us is influenced by the choices that we've made about how we live. And New Orleans, of course, is an obvious example, as it is now below sea level. It was, at the time, it was started years ago, it was pretty much at sea level. It was a great place to have a seaport, but it was always unstable and always vulnerable to flooding. And the approach can be extended theoretically to biological and technological hazards, which I don't say too much about today, but Bhopal and Chernobyl and even the avian flu in the way that humans raise chickens and other kinds of domesticated birds and how close they live and interact with them. Now, this four-stage cycle is just for the information, for your information. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but I throw this in here. It comes up in the literature a lot, and if you're interested in exploring it, you should know that most people conceptualize disasters in these four stages, between mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And for this distinction, to go back to that distinction I made between ethics in disasters and ethics of disasters, the ethics of disasters focuses primarily, I think, on issues in this mitigation and preparedness stages. This is what we do before disasters hit that make things disasters, something disasters. The recovery and the response are things more having to do with ethical issues more in disasters. But in this view, human beings are viewed as responsible for disasters, as causing disasters, based on the choices we make that render us vulnerable. Now, I want to just pause there because this claim for me, when I first realized it was being made, was counterintuitive. And I wonder if it is for any of you. since I'm a sailor, I found this sailing analogy to be particularly helpful. Not that I particularly liked it, but it was a good analogy. Under this understanding, it would be improper to say a ship was caused to be wrecked by a storm, or a storm caused a shipwreck. What would be more proper to say is that the storm revealed the vulnerabilities that were already present in the ship and its captain and crew, who, in spite of the storm, remain accountable for the choices they made that made the ship vulnerable. That's the kind of theoretical shift you've got to get your mind around to understand the difference between that event-agent model and the hazard model. And we can talk more about this as we go, too, but there is a concomitant claim here that our vulnerability is actually increasing with the complexity and interconnectedness of our societies, as especially in the developed world. And we'll say more about that as we go. Let me pause there and see if you have any questions or comments about what I've said thus far, because I'm going pretty quickly. Either I've left you all behind or it's plain, so okay. The third approach I want to talk about is understanding disasters as social construction. Now, it would be wrong to say that disasters, in this view, disasters are what we call them, or what we make them to be, or what we call them to be. That would be an exaggeration. But what we do understand by disasters in this case, or how we understand them, is by examining the internal processes of a society that interest groups and other stakeholders use to, quote, place disaster-related problems on the public agenda and elicit the kind of governmental and institutional response they believe is warranted. Okay? So what counts as a disaster is me coming here, getting paid a stipend or an honorarium from the Schilling Foundation or lectureship to come and try to advocate for you what should count as a disaster. That's an example of this kind of social construction. Another example might be to think about 9/11, which killed approximately 3,000 people, and I think most of us in this room would agree that that would probably should be classified as a disaster, and yet we have 40,000 approximately highway fatalities in this country alone every year, and we don't think, most of us I suspect, don't think of that as a disaster. So ask yourself why that might be the case. Why do some events, agents, activities get classed as disasters and some don't? Well, this is an attempt to try to explain that by looking internally to those people who actually try to make claims about disasters and get them on the public agenda. Here's an example that might be a little closer to home for us, we academics. This is a quote here. Education in hazard mitigation and preparedness should expand to include interdisciplinary and holistic degree programs. Members of the higher education community will have to invent university-based programs. This will require not only new degree programs, but also changes in the way institutions of higher education reward faculty who are now encouraged to do theoretical work. This is somebody who's advocating that universities pick up the baton and create the kind of programs that are necessary to actually study disasters, understand them, and mitigate them, and prepare for them in better ways. But it's an example of this social construction approach to disasters. Disasters are what we call them, or what we in interest groups convince you that should be counted as a disaster. And here's yet another example. Future work must also focus on techniques for enlisting public and governmental support for making sustainable hazard mitigation a, quote, fundamental social value. Now, I believe that is a good thing to do, that if mitigation became a fundamental social value, I think that would be good. But here I'm using that as a way to illustrate how a social construction approach to disasters would work, and how interest groups could take this and then use it, as I'm sure people in this university are doing, and this is not a criticism, to get money out of governments or other funding agencies to do their work for very good reasons, in most cases, to promote awareness of, knowledge of disaster preparedness and mitigation. And I'm doing the same, so I can't throw stones. It's not a denial of the existence of extreme physical events or agents, but it is a strong claim that the potential for disaster is imminent in society itself. So we've moved now from a natural event that happens from outside of us, rather passive humans kind of just experiencing this thing, to a product that's jointly natural and created by the choices that we make as human beings, to an understanding where disasters are entirely imminent in society. Human beings are entirely responsible for and accountable for the disasters they experience. Disasters are viewed as arising as a consequence of the very social relations and practices that characterize a society as such. Many of these are structural and thus very resistant to change. Now, what would be a structural view of that? A structural understanding of society would talk about those values or institutions that are kind of given with the society itself. It could be legal. It could be more amorphous societal values, so that it says, for example, people have a right to live wherever they want to live. Oh, but if they can get the government to help give them some flood insurance along the way, that would be good too. And so once you get these things in place, it's very, very difficult to unwind them. Those are kind of examples, and we'll have more to say about this as we go. Now, there's a last group of what really are newer approaches to understanding disasters that I'm going to kind of group here in a cluster under what I call vulnerability models. And these are models that suggest that, especially in the developed world, and we'll have a little bit to say about the developing world in a minute, but especially in the developed world is becoming structurally more risky. Okay? So think about all we're doing and all the billions of dollars that we're spending to ward off and mitigate disasters in our society. And this is a claim that all that we're doing is making society actually more risky for us. And risk is understood here explicitly, following Luhmann, as those potential losses for developed society that result explicitly from human choice. And there's concerns here about how technology and economic interconnectedness are producing greater and greater societal risk. And think about the technologies that we use to mitigate risk that are themselves highly complex and may actually, in the end, increase risk. And I'm thinking here of years ago when I was not too far away from 3 Mile Island, and some of these examples where the technology that you're using to mitigate the risks of the technology depends on other kinds of technology. And if those technologies don't work in a very kind of systematic and predictable way, the risks can get out of hand astronomically fast. At the same time, and this is some of the frustration that I'm dealing with at the end of this process for myself, at the same time, because of these structural elements, it's increasingly difficult to identify those choices and who made them that lead to a particular kind of risk that might actually produce a disaster. A lot of our choices are made by, quote-unquote, faceless bureaucrats. Many are made collectively. Many times we cannot trace very accurately the source of certain choices or decisions that are made in society or they might be made in past generations even. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So even though human agency is at the center of this view, it can be very difficult to trace responsibility and accountability. But it does highlight how the vulnerability of all of us is increasingly dependent on the decisions of a few elites, economic and political elites. And this last point is emphasized in another related approach called, by some at least, the political economy approach to disaster, which views disaster victimization as a consequence of decisions made by political and economic elites. And here are some examples of intensive land use and development in the developed world concentrates populations and yields greater losses. So we make a levee around New Orleans and the population begins to grow, and then the levee breaks and the disaster is that much worse. Or the environmental stresses in the developing world that lead to disasters as resources are exploited and dependency is fostered in the developing world. Now, in contrast to the hazard approach, which sees government as an agent reducing vulnerability, this approach views government as a key actor in causing disasters. So in one approach, that governments are the good guys. In this approach, government is the bad guy, or at least potentially the bad guy. And there's yet another theory that I've grouped under this ecological vulnerability perspective. And this claims that disasters, in fact, do not have random effects, which is something that seems intuitive to us, but disproportionately harm groups that are already socially marginalized by other factors. And again, Katrina brought that home to us very vividly a few years ago, and continuing to. These are some of the factors that could make a difference in making populations more vulnerable. And finally, just a word about conflict itself. There's a debate in the sociological literature about disasters as to whether conflict situations should be distinguished from disasters. And there's no debate that war or terrorism can result in disaster-like effects or results for human populations. But there's a debate as to whether they should be classed as disasters. Disasters are said to be, in this literature, crises of consensus. And what that generally means is that when there's a disaster, people pull together, work together to try to solve the problems that disasters create. And in fact, there's a remarkable amount of research about how that works, and there's all kinds of anecdotal stories about how well it works also. In conflict crises, you have at least some agents who are trying to make things worse for everybody else. They're going around planting bombs, or whatever you're doing to try to mitigate the problem. They're trying to disrupt your efforts, and we have all kinds of examples of that today as well. Questions or comments? I want to have a few implications and questions myself that I raised. But I have a few more slides. I just want to give a pause here for people to see if they have any questions. Here's a few of my own that I've raised and a few implications that I've drawn from this research. I've already suggested to you that views on disasters have actually evolved from being something that's views external to human society to a joint product of natural events and human choices, and finally is something that's entirely internal to human society. So it is a way to bring through these different theories, it does bring the notion of disasters into the moral equation. There is a movement in U.S. research toward greater diversity in approaches. But I should point out, if we had more time, we could go into this. Many of these approaches are compatible and are not incompatible with others. So there's a lot of overlap, and especially that's why I grouped these last three views together. And many of these earlier views are still influential. The dominant approach is not these later views, but it's really the hazard approach right now, which views the disaster as the joint product between a natural event or some kind of an event and human choices. But as we probably all know, there's many people who still think of disasters as purely natural events or that just happen to people, or even as acts of God. There's probably people in this room who think of disasters as acts of God. And in case you missed the obvious, I want to make sure you don't go away with any doubt in what I'm trying to say here. I'm using it as a quote. Human beings, not nature, are the cause of disaster losses. The choices that are made about where and how human development will proceed actually determine the losses actually determine the losses that will be suffered in future disasters. And again, this kind of claim and argument makes disasters successfully analyzable in ethical terms, and thus we should be able to assign responsibility and accountability. However, after all this work, I'm a little bit disappointed in my own conclusion, because I don't think this conclusion will do all the work I hope it will do. The structural elements of society and the collective nature of the relevant choices make it hard to assign, very hard to assign responsibility and accountability. And increasing societal and economic complexity also contribute to this concern. And so I ask this question rhetorically, in some sense: are we all complicit? And if all of us are complicit, then are any of us somehow complicit? It's tempting to hold governments accountable, but which governments? And at what levels? And at what time in history? How should these levels coordinate, or can they be coordinated? So who should be held accountable for development choices that are made by local governments, made appropriately by local governments, that render citizens more vulnerable? And here I'm thinking of the development standards that are used in housing and the placement of populations, flood insurance programs that make it easier to live in flood-prone areas, even though many people don't have the insurance. We were discussing last night over dinner, and out in Seattle, we live in the shadow of a number of volcanoes, and I heard recently that they were recently putting housing tracts up the sides of volcanoes where we have historically had lava flow in the past. Now, I can tell you I'm not buying a home there, but hundreds of people are, maybe thousands. We should also look, and the literature is very strong on this, and I don't really talk much about this today, but we should also look to non-governmental agencies, business and civic organizations, and private citizens. There's a lot of talk in the literature about what organizations should do, not just governments, but organizations should do, and you should do as citizens and private individuals to prepare for and to try to mitigate the effects of disasters on yourselves. Do you have a household plan, a communication plan? Does your organization have plans? I know that this organization is working on that. Nevertheless, even though allocating responsibility and accountability is difficult, I still think it should be attempted. Research shows that in the recovery phase, which I'm not really talking about today, that the recovery phase can be most effective when the community-based organizations assume the principal responsibility for redevelopment. Okay, if you depend on federal government, things may not happen, and we've seen that to be the case. And I'm wondering here, just again rhetorically, might this be extended to mitigation and preparation phases? Is it better that responsibility be at the local level, or at a more macro level, or some kind of shared responsibility? It is likely that future disasters, all through the literature, there's a concern that disasters will get worse because of this interconnectedness of society and the economy and the population growth that we've had. So the same kind of event 100 years ago would have less bad effects than it would have today, potentially. Many disasters will be and have been already bad enough to undermine the legitimacy of governments and government officials. If we think that government should be doing more to help mitigate and prepare us for disasters, and then they're not doing that, when they do happen, those governments may be more vulnerable. So this vulnerability, as we've seen in recent responses by our own government, might make for some incentives for officials to respond in compassionate ways to those who are affected by disasters, after the fact, unfortunately, maybe. But will they be the best ways? Again, we were discussing last night about the President's very quick promise on television to rebuild New Orleans after Katrina. And was that the best way to respond? It was a compassionate way and an understandable way to respond, both politically and as from a human perspective, but was it the best way to respond? There's lots of discussion in the literature that governments should utilize the disruption caused by disasters to mitigate the effects of future, potentially far worse disasters. So the levees and the decisions about the levees were made in past generations. There's not much we can do about that now, but the levees break, there's a flood, there's a chance to use that as an occasion not to repeat the same mistake. Okay? A few months ago I read, there was great excitement that the Army Corps of Engineers were going to rebuild the levees to the pre-Katrina strengths. And I wondered why that was cause for celebration by anybody, because we know that that was not good enough. There's also increasing discussion that past mitigation efforts have merely postponed disasters. Okay? There's lots of concern right now for the many, many small and large dams that were built 50, 100 years ago around the country to mitigate floods. Those dams were never meant to last, as I gather, many of them were not meant to last as long as they have, and they are in dire need of attention at a very high price. In the meantime, many, many, many more people have moved in to the flood areas underneath those dams or around those dams, and so their vulnerability has actually increased. And so what we've done, according to this approach, would be to suggest we've just merely postponed the disaster. We haven't really escaped it. And when the disaster hits, they will actually be worse. So at the end of the day, for me, my key question here is, what do we owe victims of disasters as a matter of justice and not just charity? So it's one thing for us in our charity or our concern or natural compassion to respond to victims of Katrina or other kinds of disaster victims around the world, but what do we owe them as a matter of justice, as part of our community? And that's a much larger discussion, but for example, we could have offered help for the poor people of the 9th Ward to actually relocate, rather than not just to get them out of the flood area when the disaster hit, but actually to relocate and rebuild their lives elsewhere. Now, would that be an act of charity for us to do that, or do we somehow owe it to the population of people who live in vulnerable areas because they're part of our community? And I think that's a question that needs to be nuanced. I think in some cases there would be a case, as a matter of justice, we owe them certain things, and in some cases we might not. And then there's this interesting argument in ethics that gets, and I have a lot of research in my past about multiple generational issues in terms of ethics, and one of the things that comes up are these what are called upstream, downstream issues. And that can be applied literally, in the case of disasters around rivers, upstream and downstream, like how a levee construction helps somebody upstream to navigate the Mississippi River. There's a levee constructed, but downstream it helps to undermine the protection for the people of New Orleans. But you can also think of that in terms of generational issues. So what are we doing today that's going to make our future, our children, our grandchildren more vulnerable downstream from us in terms of the time? So that's my presentation, and I'm open to questions and discussions right now. About 25 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Heller, for that fascinating talk. I realized that when I introduced Dr. Heller, I failed to introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Marks. I'm the director of the Bioethics and Medical Humanities program here at University Park. And I'm also going to serve as moderator for the questions. So do I have anyone who would like to ask a question, or will I exercise my moderator's privilege? All right, well, while you're thinking about a question, I will exercise my moderator's privilege. So I'm curious to know what your views are about the rebuilding of New Orleans, just to push you a little more on
I thought that I might get that question.
on how the models help you and what you think the proposed solution is.
Well, there's lots of examples in the New Orleans or the Katrina incident there from the social construction perspective, where people are using New Orleans as a reason to try to get resources from the government to do what they want to do. Now, whether those resources are getting to where they need to be is an open question. But so there's plenty of examples there. I do think what I suggested at the end about knowing that, imagine New Orleans before Katrina. You know you've got levees, you know you've got vulnerabilities. I think it would be hard to make a case morally and certainly economically that you ought to go in and somehow disrupt all that commerce, all those people's lives, and all that culture that's so unique to New Orleans, simply to try to mitigate some kind of future disaster. But now that the disaster's happened, it seemed wrong to me intuitively, and I think on reflection now, it seems wrong to me to try, frankly, to rebuild it. Because I think what we're doing is we would simply be setting up some, imagine a poor, vulnerable African-American family who's been kicked out of their homes by the flood. They just want to go back and rebuild. You can understand that. They get back there, and they live successfully for a generation, and their children are growing up in the same house or the same neighborhood, which could easily happen in New Orleans neighborhood. And another disaster hits, and there's that many more people there, it's that much more worse. I just don't think it can be justified.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. That was an interesting presentation. I want to ask how the social construction of disaster reflects more broadly the values and principles that organize a society. So after Katrina, where the exit strategy was to have your own car and to organize your own way out, and those who needed public transportation had no means of getting there, there were some articles about Cuba, who gets hit by hurricanes regularly, but has at a very local level a very organized system of disaster preparedness, where all the local doctors, and they practice it regularly, so that there's a sort of socialized system around risk, and a notion of people aren't on their own to deal with it. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. I mean, in the individualism that we have and the economic disparities that we have in our society, especially in New Orleans, we kind of lived out the kind of structural values that I'm concerned about, that individualism that says, okay, I'm getting out and my family's getting out, and I've got good insurance, by the way, so if it hits, well, I can rebuild. But the thousands of people who didn't. Now, I don't know about Cuba in their structure, but one of the interesting things to speculate is China might be another example, that in times of disaster, some of these areas with stronger centralized kinds of governments that can organize and actually move resources very quickly and efficiently might have certain kind of advantages over a decentralized. On the other hand, if people who get overly dependent on command and control structures from a centralized kind of actor, if that communication is cut off, sometimes people get paralyzed in ways that they wouldn't in a more decentralized. So I think you have to kind of weigh those. But I think, the individualism of the United States and our economic individualism that is an example of the kind of structural value I'm talking about. And then you might also get some values about, all of the volunteers that came in and the kind of charity and the wonderful response of people around the country to the victims of disaster like Katrina and others. But then after that, where's the justice? Where's the actual rebuilding and the hard questions that are getting asked about the relocation and help and stuff like that, which might be a lot cheaper in the end, interestingly enough, than rebuilding. Dean Pell.
So this was a really interesting talk, and you focused on, I'd say, the easy disaster, which is the natural. Talk about man-made disaster, like the September 11th bomb or a dirty bomb. So what's the answer there? Should we not be building tall buildings? Should we not live in aggregated environments? Or do we have to do something about solving? Is it possible even to contemplate you could ever solve it politically and make us less vulnerable?
Well, I can contemplate that. Whether I'm hopeful or not, I don't know. You're pushing me toward, I think, a more ethics in disaster kind of argument that I'm not really prepared to go into in much depth. But I do think that there is a lot in the literature that suggests that disasters, whether they're quote-unquote natural or man-made or technological or biological, there's different ways of talking about those, ultimately need to be treated, at least by the social scientists, tend to get treated as the same kind of phenomenon. So whether they're a technological disaster like Chernobyl or a natural disaster like a hurricane or something like that, they tend to get understood in the same kind of way because the choices that make those kind of events bad for human beings are related to the kind of choices that we make as a society or as individuals or something like that. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, the examples that you used from, get to the terrorist and the conflict kind of examples that, at least in the literature, are only arguably considered disasters from this social science perspective. Again, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have to take steps to mitigate them, but they might be different kind of steps. The kind of steps you would take to prepare for a hurricane, something like that, when you assume that when it hits, you're going to get help from people on the ground, that people are going to work together to try. That's a very different kind of assumption than you'd have to go into a conflict situation, I think, where you have people who might be trying to work to make things worse. A small example of that is in Iraq, where they set off a bomb, they wait for people to gather to address that bomb, and they send in 2 or 3 more because they know that people are going to respond that way. So that's a very different, and I'm not really prepared to, as much as I'd like to, I'm not prepared to argue that.
Hi. It seems, I guess what I've gathered is that, from what you've said, is that the best response to a lot of these things are sort of a flexible approach to resilience, essentially, in these situations, whether it's within a social ecological context, or whether it's within more of a societal context of the man-made disasters versus the natural disasters. And it also seems like this flexibility and the capacity for resilience is cultivated within a community. And I'm wondering, we've talked about responsibility at government level, and we've talked about responsibility at the community level. And at what point is it reasonable to assume the capacity of a community, whether it's at the governmental level or at the more local level, and then how does that community then go ahead and work to cultivate a more resilient capacity to deal with disasters?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but resiliency is something that's very, very important. It's not something I really talked about, but I would think that I'm more concerned about making communities or constructing communities in such a way as to limit the need for resiliency in this discussion, if that makes sense to you. In other words, resiliency is something that you talk about after the disaster's hit, I gather.
I guess my thought on resilience would be that resilience is looking at it from the capacity for resilience. If you look at it sort of in terms of, like in geography, they talk about basins of attraction, where the capacity for resilience is the ability to move from one stable basin to another stable basin and weather disasters so that you can maintain stability, and getting rid of sort of an equilibrium paradigm, getting rid of the idea that nature will stay stable,
right,
and more accepting the idea that it will be dynamic.
Right.
And
you can't mitigate all the hazards, right?
Exactly. Right. But then I'm wondering, at what level does the community does it cease to be community involvement in terms of resilience? So with the idea that resilience should be facilitated at all times. And it seems to me from what you said that in a lot of ways community is an important facet in cultivating resilience. At what level does it cease to be community, essentially? And then, or where's the cutoff for community? Is it the local town? Is it the block? Is it the neighborhood? Is it the local government? Is it the national government? Is it an international government? Because we talk about community in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah.
And then within that, what would you suggest in terms of cultivating resilience within whatever level of community you think?
Well, I think cultivating resiliency is a good thing, but let me get at this a different kind of way. Imagine that you're part of the community in New Orleans, and you love that community the way people love New Orleans who have been raised there. And you have a chance now after Katrina to rebuild it. Okay, that would be an example of, if you're successful in rebuilding it, that would be an example of community resiliency. But I think that would be also an example of a bad choice for a community to make, and that a wider area of a wider agent like a federal government or a state government should help the community in that kind of case make a different kind of choice. No, I know that's not answering your question, but I think that's the best I can do today. Go ahead.
Do you think that we should treat victims or people differently who are in areas that are known to be more vulnerable rather than areas that have never been hit before? Like, do you think that at some point there should be a cutoff as to how much we help these people if they continue to go back in a place that is known for getting hit so hard?
Yeah, that would seem to follow from some of what I'm saying, wouldn't it? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer in practical terms. But just take, for example, people who are building, the $1 million beach houses on the exposed beaches in South Carolina or North Carolina. And we know that they're going to get destroyed periodically. And I'm perfectly willing to let them do that, but I'm not willing to help pay for them to do that. Okay? Now, if there's a community that grows up there in a more kind of natural way, I'm not sure how to say this, but communities that have been there for generations, that don't have the kind of resources that are available to people who choose to make those kinds of choices, then I think we owe those people more than we owe the people who have the $1 million houses. I'd be willing to let the market, the insurance market, determine a lot of those things. I'm not sure how you all feel about that, but I think that would be a pretty good indicator. The fact that I couldn't get insurance of a certain kind in a floodplain would tell me that's probably not a good place to live. Now, if I didn't have a choice, or if there was some reason that my society thought it was good for me to live there, and that there was some kind of compensation for that and support, that would be a different thing. You need to have a port in New Orleans, theoretically, and maybe we could have a port there and some people that need to live there for those kinds of reasons, without having hundreds of thousands of people doing other kinds of things there. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
On the issue of ethics of disaster, in light of Hurricane Katrina, it has been proposed that there is a relation between global warming and this particular natural disaster, such as the documentary Inconvenient Truth. So I have 3 questions following that. First, do you agree with this proposal? Second, conditionally, if you accept the correlation, to what extent then are we accountable, or both accountable and responsible, for that disaster? And following that, thirdly, are you proposing that Hurricane Katrina could have been prevented?
The hurricane, the last one is easy. The hurricane could not have been prevented.
Or predicted, I'm sorry.
Well, it was predicted, but it couldn't have been prevented, but the disaster could have been prevented. That's the argument. The hurricanes probably can't be prevented. The earthquakes probably can't be prevented, but the disasters can be prevented. by different kinds of planning. But so your first question is, do I think that global warming is involved? I'm not a climatologist or climate expert, but yeah, I think it's probably involved, based on what little I've read. I mean, I think they're not causing the hurricanes, but they're probably making them worse in some situations, at least in the Gulf area. And what was the second question then?
Conditionally, if you did accept this correlation, this relationship, to what extent can you thread the accountability, the responsibility, or both to all of us?
You may know the literature better than I do. How responsible are human choices for the global warming that we have right now? The scientists are... John, what's the recent literature on that? It's a pretty high percentage that at least scientists seem to think that we are at least hurrying what could be a natural process. We're at least hurrying it along at a pretty good clip. So I would say, that's one of the problems with the earlier definition of disasters as a sudden event, because it rules out global warming as a disaster. We know that global warming, if it continues, will surely have disastrous consequences for us. So.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Do you think if Hurricane Katrina happened in a more affluent area, the response would have been quicker by the government?
I don't know. I don't know. All I know, I wasn't too dismayed by how quickly the government responded. I was really dismayed by how badly the local government prepared for its people, to protect its people, and I was very dismayed by how disorganized the response was.
Going off that question, if it were to happen to a different area, more affluent, like she said, would your response in rebuilding be different?
I'd let the market determine that in a more affluent area. So in other words, if somebody has the money for the insurance and they want to take the risk, I'd let them do it. But I would ask them not to ask the public to help support that. Or not as much, anyway. Okay.
But that sort of brings up another question which you haven't really dealt with very much in this discussion, which is that disasters are all somewhat based on risk and unpredictability of risk. You don't know that they're going to happen, so there's a guess. However, what does seem to happen is that certain people bear the brunt of that risk. It's not the rich, and it's not the affluent. Right. The people who have insurance easily rebuild their houses. And in fact, the rest of society is paying the insurance because the people who've made the decision to build a house on the hills of North Carolina usually have the money and control the mechanisms of society to get them that insurance. Why is it, and what's the ethical issue about I presume it's a fact, that certain people bear the risk disproportionately, that in fact it's the poor and the people who can't make those choices who end up paying, and then later on we say, well, the market should solve that problem, but there is no market to solve that problem.
And I didn't mean to extend that market argument to the poor, and that's why I was saying earlier that this needs to be nuanced. I mean, if you're asking me, yes, in some sense we're paying as an insurance pool, we're all paying for the building of the rich places. Yes, that's a kind of voluntary thing, though, in a way that taxes and other kinds of support are not. And so I think that makes a difference, maybe, ethically. But for the poor, as these models are suggesting, that these are not random effects, or at least not in large ways, that the poor do disproportionately, I think we owe them something differently than a market response. And I'm not prepared to argue in a nuanced way about that. But in a general sense, I think we owe them, as a matter of justice, not charity, but as a matter of justice, something different than we.
Thank you for your talk. It was very thought-provoking, and I want to spend some time with the models that you've introduced us to. I think I'm not positive what my question is, so we'll see if it comes out.
Okay.
But I think
I'm not positive what my answer will be either.
The categories are more complicated than they seem on the face,
Yes.
on the surface. So you have one category is you have a natural event that occurs. Another category is no, it's not simply a natural event, but an interaction between a natural event and a social context, and that interaction has to be taken into consideration. And the third, what you're calling social construction, is that it's got nothing to do with natural. It has to do with the way in which society is organized. But if you look at the different types of examples that have been put on the table today, they seem to belie those simple divisions. So one of the reasons why the question as to whether or not Katrina was impacted by climate change seems relevant is the question of accountability, because the phenomena itself, that hurricane, isn't simply a natural event. It's got human fingerprints woven into it.
Yeah, that's true.
So that the very event itself, the hurricane, is a mixture. But there clearly are phenomena like the rupture of Mount St. Helens that, as far as I know, was simply natural. It didn't have that social mixture in with it. And then, you have to look at the impact that it had. And again, you can look at a tornado that hits down somewhere in the Midwest. Yes, tornadoes happen, but there aren't clear paths, where you'd want to say that when you're looking at ethics of, not ethics in, that there aren't other additional features. But then when you go back to New Orleans, part of what made New Orleans so vulnerable were many, many, many human choices in which we engineered that environment. New Orleans was very much constructed, and that seems to be another factor. So it looks like you have to work these variables in multiple ways if what you're looking for, and I know that you are, is moral accountability. Because then it's going to parse in such a complicated way. I mean, it's people across the United States and developed countries driving cars that are contributing to the intensity of the hurricane, decisions made by lots of individuals about the way in which New Orleans. So how do you go about what I think you want to get at is moral accountability and how we parse that. But how do you do that in this really complex mix? How do you help us do that?
Well, you've just, in a much better way than I have kind of summed up the frustration of that I felt at the end of the study, because that was the very kind of conclusion that I came to, that it's not just a matter of allocating resources, it's a matter of allocating accountability, and how do we do that given this kind of complexity. And I don't think there's any easy answer to that at all. But I do think that number one, by getting if we could get a clear consensus in this country that we humans should be held accountable for these kind of events, then I think that would be a step forward. We could at least raise the question, and then our government, which seems to be sometimes not very responsive in very creative ways, might be held more accountable in itself. But it's not just government, as you mentioned. It's all these choices, it's 100 economic choices, thousands that we make every day, that kind of add up to bad effects. And there is a literature there is a literature on that in ethics, and it is complex. But and there's this whole notion of complicity, which I've researched somewhat too. But I don't think I have an easy answer for you. And if I did, I think I'd write my book and retire. But it does seem to me, though, if we could get a consensus amongst us that, say, global warming was making hurricanes worse, I think that would somehow be a good thing. And then and then we could start asking these questions about what we could do to start mitigating some of those kinds of effects. And it would be a generational kind of exercise. It wouldn't be a quick thing. And the other thing that's been hinted at, I think already maybe by Jonathan, is that in the literature, it's quite clear, you just can't mitigate all the disaster, all the hazards. And we live in a risky world, and we have to take risks to live. And so you do need to think about the recovery, response, and resiliency kinds of questions that I did not address today at some point, because you can't plan around all those. Sorry I don't have a better answer for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the title of this lecture was Preliminary Reflections. If all my students' preliminary reflections are as sophisticated as that, they'll all be getting A's. So please join me in thanking Dr. Heller for his excellent lecture.